Hello and welcome. On the 31st October, a few weeks ago, we had a webinar and we named it Boss Shabaab and the pathway for the Somali youth. It attracted a lot of attention, perhaps even more attention than we anticipated, hence the delay of submitting or uploading the video. So what I really want to do is basically quickly tell you, give you some background what it's about, since I have edited the video a lot and some of you might find it a bit disjointed. The webinar was really focused on the new phenomena, the fight against the Shabaab, which we were all excited and we are still excited, and we didn't forget about the drought and the famine and all the other issues that. In a nutshell, what I really want to tell you is what the webinar was about. It was about the Maui slave phenomenon, and Ware talks about that in detail, and we want to thank Ware on his role in that. So although the main question was where to from here, really we were contextualizing with the new phenomenon of the fight against the Shabaab. And we also invited other people who we wanted to hear from them in a general way to contextualize so that we can see what else is happening around the world. Hence the invitation that we sent to Dr. Burton from Deakin University. We also invited Berhan, who is a Eritrean who lives in Melbourne, who will also give us the Horn of Africa perspective. Abdullahi Ibrahim is one of them, who also talks about the diaspora in Melbourne and Somali diaspora and their views on this issue. So I want to thank them all, and I want to thank you as well for watching this. Your feedback, comments are always welcome. We are going through an interesting time, but I'm very optimistic that at the end of the day, we will win and the Shababs will be history. Now, there were other people who participated. Mohammed Wahalia, Honorable Mohammed Wahalia, who's a legislator from the Somali Parliament. There was also Mohammed Ahmed Brigato, many of you know, who's based in Sydney, and Hassan Jama of SBS, our local journalist or global journalist. I want to thank them all. I hope you like this video. Let's think about it, reflect on it. It's till next time. Thank you, and please send us your feedback. Enjoy it. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us tonight. We are having this webinar to raise awareness among the Somalis in the diaspora, as well as back home in Somalia, and also in Australia specifically, where this webinar is coming from Melbourne. So we named this webinar Post-Shabaab Pathways for Somali Youth. Really, our focus is on the Somali youth. The word Shabaab itself, as an Arabic word, means the youth. Without further ado, and I know we have limited time, I want to invite His Excellency, former President of Israel, Mohammed Abdi Ware. Please welcome, tell us what's going on and where to from here.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I think it's an evening for you over there. I will give you a brief historical background of the fight against the Shabaab, especially the Mahawisle phenomena, so that you can contextualize all the other issues that you are talking about. On the 16th of September 2017, I was elected as the president of Shabaab. 8 days later, on the 24th of September, I flew into Bulaburti and Jalalaksi, two towns in Hiran region, in a UN helicopter under the protection of the AMISOM troops there. If any illustration was needed for how weak and besieged my administration was, that picture said it all. So when I came to these towns, these two towns, basically garrison towns, completely blocked and cut off from the surrounding areas, including their farmland, I knew that something urgent had to be done. When the population of the town, especially of Bulaburti, which was my first stop, came out, as was ordinary, they talked to me about all the government services that they wanted in their town, education, a hospital, a court, and the other government services. For them, this was a challenge, and for me, this was an opportunity. I told them, I'm not going to promise you things. If you want to live in these dire circumstances, blocked up from everywhere, basically living in an open air prison, there is nothing I could do for you. But if you, with all the young men that came out to see me, literally hundreds of them, with all the young men in the audience, if you want to do something about your circumstances, then when I see you energized and mobilized, then my government, my administration will try to help you, and we will help you. But today, I'm not going to tell you anything about what we are going to do unless you show me that you are energized and want to do something about changing your situation. This is the beginning of the Ma'awisle uprising. In less than 4 weeks, we liberated the eastern part of Iran. As you probably know, Iran is divided into almost half by the Shabelle River. So from a tactical point of view, we had to mobilize the people on the eastern side of the river so that we could control the bridges. And once we control the bridges, then we could shift our resources to the west. The successes that we have achieved in these 4 weeks, with the help of the AMISOM troops in Beledweyne, Bulaburti, and Jalalaqsi, namely the Djiboutians and the Ethiopians, who for a long time were basically in defensive force protection postures, because they did not feel that the local population and the local communities were energized enough, and they did not want to do this on their own. So with this joint effort, we were able to liberate the eastern part of Iran, and this brought the attention of everybody around the country. In the end, this, what I like to call Ma'awisle 1, despite the initial successes, when we reached the boundary between Iran and Middle Shabelle, the Shabab, of course, came with a propaganda that, in fact, since this was a clan-based movement, this was not a freedom movement, this was a clan trying to extend their territorial boundaries. So they mobilized this clanic sentiment against us. A very important lesson that we have learned, and I will come to this when we discuss this current offensive, what I call the Ma'awisle 2. So we had to stop and try to mobilize the same from Middle Shabelle, from the other clan, the other main clan in Middle Shabelle. In the end, with all our efforts, I'm sorry to say that with the initial successes, the overall result of Ma'awisle 1 was failure for 3 reasons. One, the central government, the government at that time, was not supportive of this initiative. And the reason that they were not supportive is very complicated, and I think it is beyond the scope of this webinar. But they were not supportive. And secondly, there were not any similar uprisings in other regions and in other parts of the country, which made possible for the Shabab to pull all the resources and come after us in Eastern Iran. This was also a big problem. And I will also get to it as well as it relates to this current offensive. And thirdly, unfortunately, we had the flooding of 2018 in Iran. Many of you know about this. And our attention was diverted to the flood rescue efforts, and many of the supply lines were also bogged down in water. But the success of this Ma'awisle 1 was instilled in the hearts of people. It demonstrated that the Shabab could be beaten, that a local community can take arms against the Shabab, and that the aura of invisibility and the specter of terror could be fronted head on. In recognition of this, even though we did not get as much support and as much attention inside the country, I was invited to attend a peer-to-peer conference organized by the Swedish Folk Bernadette, is the Swedish Institute for Peace and Security, which also invited the governor of Borno State of Nigeria, where, as you know, the Boko Haram is operating. And myself and the then governor, Honorable Qasim Shatima, we compared notes on how to fight radical armed movements at the subnational level. I was a governor, basically I was a governor, and he was a governor. And our strategies were, you know, the sky and the ground. We were so far apart because their strategy was a heavy, centralized, very expensive, military-centered, heavy armor-oriented offensive against the Boko Haram, while our strategy was to go after the Shabaab using the local communities, the local mobilization, and the local resources. Fast forward, we were also visited by the in June of the next year, we were visited by the AU Peace and Security Council. A delegation was sent to Beledweyne to try to see how these community-based initiatives could be incorporated into the fight against the Shabaab, which AMISOM was trying to rethink and to re-engineer. Fast forward now to today. In late 2019, the Shabaab, having seen the problems that local community uprisings can do to them, tried to make a deal with the local community. The local community, because the government, the central government, was not supportive, there was no other initiatives in other parts of the country. They could see that they themselves alone could not sustain this over the long run. Also tried to talk to the Shabaab. The Shabaab came what at the time, from the elders' point of view, was a good deal. The Shabaab said, we pay all DS or blood money compensation for all the people that have been killed in that conflict from the community side, while they were able, while they were willing to forgive or to ignore the casualties on their end. They promised to not interfere in the affairs of this clan. They would leave them to be by themselves, and so on and so forth. Of course, the Shabaab reneged on all this movement, on all these promises, and that movement faltered away, and they started even to kill some of the elders that have been involved in this negotiation. This disappointment and this pressure and this harassment continued. This, as you know, the illegal zakats and so on and so forth. Finally, in the drought situation that we are in now, it was becoming unbearable. There was some revolt against the Shabaab. Of course, the Shabaab came from as far as Jubaland to teach, quote unquote, teach these folks a lesson again, and went after them really very hard. There was one incident in which a convoy of civilian trucks traveling from Beledweyne to Mahas was basically ambushed, and they took 20 civilians, put them in a minibus with children, with women, with everything, and burned them alive. Finally, the people realized this was too much. This is what precipitated this current offensive. Now, as you follow, tremendous gains have been made against the Shabaab in Iran. The three things that led to the failure of Mausley 1, Alhamdulillah, are not there. The central government is morally and materially supportive. There are uprisings in other parts of the country, in Galmudug, in Southwest, in Middle Shabelle. And of course, the flooding is not there, so the fighting can be sustained. My belief, and I sincerely believe this, is that the Shabaab is now on the ropes. and we have a unique opportunity in half a generation to get rid of this menace from our lives, mainly because of two reasons. One, the Shabaab is a terror organization, and they really use terror as a military tactic. They do not have enough footprint on the country to hold it together. Therefore, they use terror. They mobilize these fast, highly mobile troops from different regions. So this spell is broken, number one. And number two, they are now spread over. They're extended. They're overextended. So we have this opportunity. If one were to ask me, why do you think this Ma'awisli phenomena is successful? It's for three reasons. One, the Somali National Army, the SNA, as a professional army, limited in number, and even including the support of the AMISOM, has always been good in what we call the destroy and degrade capability. They would go with their heavy machinery and with their heavy, armor to destroy camps, to destroy areas, and so on and so forth. But holding territory was always a challenge. Therefore, the Ma'awisli, taking exactly the same tactics as the Shabaab itself, are much more suited to holding territory. That's number one, because they live in the area. They are not going anywhere. They are not mechanized. They're fast. They're mobile. So they are able to hold territory more. Number two, even if other regions and other areas are not as effective as the fighting in Hiran, what we have demonstrated is to, if it were, for lack of a better word, increase the cost of doing business for the Shabaab, in the sense that at maximum, the Shabaab is able to put 3,000 to 3,500 fighting men into any conflict. Therefore, if they sent this to Iran, which they have done at least 3 times, and you follow, those of you who closely follow the situation in Somalia probably will know this, in Yasoman, in El Qohle, and in Jibo, they really put their final effort into this. Then they have no choice but to let other areas go. Therefore, in the long run, this is not sustainable. The third reason is, of course, the cost of conflict. The local Ma'awisli fighters are basically, pastoralists, agro-pastoralists, who have been forced to do this. Therefore, they do not have the cost that is associated with traditional military campaigns, while the Shabaab is a quasi-military organization that has to mobilize from distant areas. Therefore, the cost of fighting is incredibly asymmetric. So now, if the Shabaab was using asymmetric warfare to the government, and now the Shabaab is using exactly the same strategy against the Shabaab. And of course, there is the passion and the ownership of the conflict. Now, I will conclude by giving a small, some small ideas about where do we go from here.
Good.
I think in any conflict, there are 3 stages. The first stage is mobilization. Why do people pick arms? Very simply put, people pick arms when they have exhausted any other venue of redress for their grievances. So the Shabaab, having put tremendous pressure on these communities in a drought situation, they gave them no choice but to pick up arms. So you may have had some propaganda, some pro-Shabaab propaganda saying that the government is arming these militias and so on and so forth. No, these people have picked arms on their own, on their volition, selling their camels and their goats to buy arms or to borrow from friends or from relatives and so on and so forth. So the mobilization stage is completed. Now, once the conflict is over, and the reason for picking arms is no longer there, then many of these people, and I'm sure you have seen pictures and videos, clips of the Maoists engaged in conflict. Many of them are past a military stage. Some of them are in their 40s, in their 50s. So these are not going to be soldiers. So they will go back to their livelihoods, their livestock, their farms, their families. They have other things to do. The youth in the middle, 30, 25 like this, they can be recruited. And this is what we are working on with multiple partners and the central government to try to put these people into a community policing force. And the younger ones in their mid 25 and lower, these can be used to recruit into the SNA, into the traditional police, and so on and so forth. The final stage and the biggest challenge, of course, is disarmament. Disarmament is a very complicated process. This is not only related to this conflict, but even from the 1990s, disarmament will only be done when people are comfortable that this conflict is finally over, that the rule of law prevails, that the courts are functioning, that the government is able to sustain, that they are able to use, that they have monopoly of violence, and that they are able to use this in a just and clear and transparent way. That stage, even relatively peaceful areas like Somaliland, like Puntland, like parts of Mogadishu, people have their weapons at home. They don't take them out to the streets, and the government is only there to enforce that these weapons remain underground. For these weapons to be handed over to government, it needs basically confidence in the rule of law, that you don't need protection from your own gun, that you will get protection from the government. And that, ladies and gentlemen, as you know, is a long-term project. For people that have been in government before, like His Excellency Mohammed Ibrahim, one of the biggest problems that we need to address is disarmament, and the rule of law is something that cannot be tackled by a single administration, a 4-year term. This is something that needs successive governments. Therefore, our political disposition has to adjust to this, and we must realize that from day one, when a president is elected, he or she is not able to take care of this problem, but has to lay the foundation for successive presidents to work on this issue, so that finally, when people are comfortable that the rule of law prevails, then many of them will voluntarily hand over these weapons, because holding weapons by civilians is a nuisance. Nobody likes it. People only hold onto arms because they feel insecure. With that, I will let you folks take over, and I'm here at your disposal if you want further clarification on issues. Thank you very much. I want to thank you for inviting me to this very important endeavor.
Well, thank you, Ware, for giving us that background information. And please stay there, because there are a lot of questions from your talk and also from other areas. But I want to invite now Craig Burton from Deakin University to give us the Australian perspective and also the global perspective of this issue. And you have 10 minutes, Craig, to tell us, how do you see this issue with your expertise in this field? Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mohammed, and thank you all for the invitation. I can speak generally about some knowledge of violent extremism and groups like Shabaab. I am optimistic that eventually Shabaab will be extinguished. That's the normal course with such groups, that they dwindle as they lose social support. But I am anxious about the immediate future, given the press of the famine and the other pressures on Somalia, and of course neighboring countries like Kenya. I'm also concerned that Shabaab, although it's no doubt weakened and is at its maximum force, not so large anyway, has shown itself to be brutal and completely prepared to pay a very high price to push the offensive. So, we've been repeatedly reminded just in recent days of their ability to continue to strike into Mogadishu. Obviously, using suicide bombing tactics, it's really hard to defend against that. I'm not saying it's not possible, but I would like to be persuaded to be optimistic that in the next 6 months we'd see a complete turnaround, and maybe that is the case. But sort of looking from the outside with some interest and some general global knowledge, I still think there's good reason to be anxious and concerned, because a group like Shabaab is not easily extinguished, and it has proven itself to have great longevity. I'm also concerned that its alliance with Al-Qaeda this last decade is strategically very important to it, and it gives it all sorts of important support, not least in a sense of legitimacy and broader support from outside Somalia, as well as some expertise. I'm not sure that we are completely on top of that. I appreciate that in rural areas where it intimidates local populations and, for most people's point of view, acts like a kind of mafioso, a standover force, completely ruthlessly suppressing local populations, that there's a great desire to see it gone. But it does have some legitimacy in some communities. And apart from having some legitimacy, for many people, such are the pressing concerns of life, including this current famine and drought, that even if Shabaab is not popular, people naturally make the calculation about what they can do, what reasonable leverage they have, and what price they're prepared to pay to stand up to Shabaab. And could hardly blame people for saying, well, we don't like them, but for the moment we're stuck with them. If we try and stand up against them, they're going to extract a very high price. We've seen how brutal they are. So why should we do anything that further exposes us? And I think that's going to be a real challenge. So it's not just a question of persuading local communities that Shabaab is bad. They know that. It's a question of persuading them that Shabaab can be defeated quickly and that they will be protected and backed up, and that their daily needs, which in some cases Shabaab claims to be providing or is has some plausible access to legitimacy by being involved in local distribution and management, unless that's challenged and replaced with something which is better, it's going to be very hard to unseat them. And of course, it's no coincidence that Shabaab takes its name from its focus on the youth, and it has been able to regenerate with successive generations of youthful recruitment. It's recruiting youth in very vulnerable and very pressured circumstances, and I fully appreciate that we can be optimistic that communities want to push back against Shabaab and see it gone. But I think the reality is they've got a lot of things on their side in terms of the gruesome calculations of a terrorist insurgency group that plays this long-term asymmetrical warfare game and is prepared to use weapons like suicide bombing, and has a strong commitment to their own view of religious legitimacy and this sort of Salafist purist utopian view, which for young people in particular, at least for a period of time, can be persuasive. So for all those reasons, I'd like to suggest in our conversation it would be good to explore the path forward that gives us reasonable hope that we can see substantially push back against Shabaab. I'm not saying it's not the case. I'm just saying that from my non-regional expertise, outsider position, I want to be convinced. Not because I don't wish to see Shabaab defeated, just because I'm aware of their competency and their long-term track record and their staying power. And it never pays to underestimate an enemy. I mean, we shouldn't be defeatist and shouldn't think that groups are invulnerable, but nor should we, go to the other extreme and underestimate what a group like this can do. So I'm curious to learn. I don't have much more to contribute, save to say that I think these are all questions that we're trying to wrestle with. We can see how, in the medium term and long term, Shabaab can be defeated. It's a question of how we get there, particularly during the current pressures of this devastating drought when communities are obviously preoccupied simply with survival.
Thank you, Professor Craig Burton. I think that's interesting perspective. What I want to do now is move to Brahan, who's one of the African leaders in African community leaders in Melbourne, who also has different perspective. Before I allow my Somali friends to contribute, Brahan, if you're around, I would like you to join us, and you have 10 minutes to tell us your view on what's happening on this area. Can you hear us, Brahan?
Yes, I do.
Welcome. So please, Brahan, if you allow me, I will also add Brahan originally is from Eritrea, and there is a reason why I'm saying that. Welcome, Brahan.
Thank you, Mohammed, and thank you, everyone. And really, I like to say first for Mohammed Abdi Ware for his commitment and dedication that I've heard him, his commitment in the country and wanting to do. That makes me really feel there is hope. But one thing that I like to shed light here is, given my connection, my, as one of the fellow of the Horn of Africa, I always follow the politics very closely. The situation going in our region is more than just what we see in a micro way to each and every country. All the region is in a very sort of mixed journey, particularly now when we see what is happening in Ethiopia, the Tigray war. And also the involvement of Eritrea, especially SAS, who've got now Somali forces and Ethiopian forces in Eritrea. And all are under the direction of that rule of SAS. We know back in 2020, when November war started, the Somalis were engaged in one way or the other. So what I'm trying to say is, SAS has already got a history that he sent army to Congo. Salva Kiir in South Sudan has got very good relationship with him because SAS has done favor using Eritrean army and South Sudanese army in liberating and supporting the South Sudanese.
Peter, I want to give you the floor, and the reason I want to invite you to this discussion is you have been to Somalia, you know a little bit about the technical issues about Somalia, telecommunication sector, and so on. I would like to give you a few minutes, perhaps, to share with us your thoughts on this and how technology can be used, or what can we do to overcome this problem about the Shabaab fighting and so on. So over to you, Peter.
Yes. Yeah, thanks, Mohammed. So when we're talking about terrorism, there's probably three things that we should talk about in that context on the technology side and the telecommunication side in particular. With like the recent bomb attack just yesterday, I think it was, and another one just a few days ago. What you would want to do, what the government would want to do, is of course try and identify the perpetrators and get hold of them and hold them to account. And how do you do that? How do you trace the communication that has been going on in preparing such an attack and finding the people that were involved? There's three things that are involved. The first one is really SIM card registration, which is pretty much mandatory in most countries around the world, that when you buy a SIM card, you have to register your personal details so you can be identified. The problem with that in Somalia has been, as far as I understand, and I must say I haven't been involved for quite a number of years, but when I was last involved in Somalia, the issue with SIM card registration was that a lot of people simply do not have a personal ID document. So how do you identify people who don't have an ID document like a passport or an ID card. Maybe with fingerprinting, there's different ideas that have been put forward, but how to implement that in a country like Somalia with all the issues it has is of course a difficult one. That would be the first thing. So you can identify who owns a SIM card that may have been involved in the preparation or execution of a terror attack. Then the second one is monitoring the actual communication, and there's basically two levels of that. One is the so-called metadata, and some of you may have heard about that. This is also something that's been implemented in most countries around the world, that the telecommunications network operators are required by law to retain the so-called metadata for a number of years. Here in Australia, I think it's 2 years. And the metadata is not the actual content of communication. So this is not wiretapping. This is only the information about the call or about the message. So who was the sender of the message, or who was the originator of the call, who was the receiver of the call, or the receiver of the message, or the email communication, date and time, IP addresses, the information about the call or message, who was communicating with who and when, and also where were they located at the time, which cell tower were they using for this communication. If you have that information, that would enable you, after a bomb attack, for example, you could, law enforcement could draw certain conclusions from, communication that went on in that area at the time, through that cell tower in the area. And then with the SIM cards registered, those people could be traced. And finally, the third layer would be actual intercept of the actual communication. So it's what's commonly referred to as wiretapping. This also, there's provisions for that in the legislation in most countries around the world, that the telecom network operators have to provide facilities, the technical facilities in their networks, to enable law enforcement to intercept communication. This is referred to as lawful interception, or LI. Of course, there have to be provisions in the law as well that this cannot be abused, but for essential law enforcement purposes, this can be done with a warrant, with a court order. Yeah, so this has to be properly regulated, that there has to be a court order, and then law enforcement must be given access to these technical facilities in the networks to be able to also intercept not just the metadata, but also the content of communication. So if a certain person is a suspect, and this would be aiming at prevention of attacks, that if certain people are suspect, are on a terror watch list, for example, then law enforcement, through this legislation and through these technical facilities, would have the possibility to actually monitor and listen in and monitor emails and messages, the actual content of the communication of these particular people.
Well, thank you, Peter, for sharing that useful information with us. Now, I've been in a position once to be in charge of the Somali telecommunication, and all I can now say is that I wish we can do all those things. But now I want to open the floor to questions to the rest of the audience, and I can see Abdurrahman raising his hand. Well, we have another 20 or 25 minutes, so you can really ask your question to one particular panelist or to everyone. So we'll start with Abdurrahman Ali first, and then Honorable Mohammed, and anyone else for that matter. So Dr. Abdurrahman, please, the floor is yours. We can't hear you, Abdurrahman. You have to unmute.
First, I thank Mohammed for the presence of this webinar or meeting. I think this is the right time. It comes right time. Thanks for that. And also, I thank other participants, Farmer here and present, or Hirschel present, and other Professor Craig. I have some insightful questions that I think people on the ground, like Mohammed Ware, can answer. We know that, and I follow. He's my favorite in Twitter. I follow Mohammed, and he actually very focused on the issue. Well, issue of Al-Shabaab has been nearly 15 years now, and this happened because of the reasons that local based reasons of sympathizers, people actually in favor Al-Shabaab ideology or whatever, or exhausted, forced to accept and pay tax. And the other thing that I think is external forces, that Al-Shabaab receives support from outside Somalia. So my question is, the local people who actually fight for their survivals, they fight, they have a light weapon, less trained. And we know Al-Shabaab has a mobilization, fast mobilization. We know they have a strategic places like in Jilib and El Bur and Hagarero, which is coast to river, deep river. What's the prospect they win? Mausley can actually defeat Al-Shabaab in a local level without support, fully support from SNA and AMISOM, fully engaged, and also other member states. How likelihood they will defeat in the region and sustain? That's the one question. And the other question is, we know that Somalia has been in terror for a long, and since the transition government, federal government, nearly now 12 years, and there's no terrorism law exist. What are the problems that the parliament not able to introduce a terrorism law in the country so that they can properly prosecute people who actually financing and people who are get same ideology and actually publicly inciting the violence inside Mogadishu? Why? What stops these two questions? How likelihood local what I say Mausley can defeat Al-Shabaab at local level and maintain without support of AMISOM and SNA large scale. And the other is law, terrorism law. These 2 points I would like to ask Mohammed. Thank you.
How about you, Mohammed? Are you with us, Wari? No, we always get worried when someone is silent in that part of the world.
No. I'm very much here. Yes, very important questions. But let me make, because since you said the time is very limited, let me make 3 quick points. I think Burhan he raised a number of interesting points. Indeed, what I would say is that the Shabaab issue is, of course, a regional issue and an international issue. And unless we focus on all these entanglements, then of course the problem will not go away. So I very much acknowledge the international and regional dynamics. One thing I would like to, I was very much interested in Greg's analysis of the Shabaab from his perspective. The only thing I would add is while at least in the beginning there was some legitimacy or some perceived legitimacy of the Shabaab in some communities, I can assure you without reservation that the Shabaab, all pretenses of legitimacy, all pretenses of religious cover has been blown. The Shabaab is perceived now by most people to be a purely mafia-style protection racket without any basis in religion or anything like this, and this is being internalized by many people. Of course, His Excellency Mohammed and Peter Lang, they were involved in this issue, the role of technology in fighting Al-Shabaab. And I'm sure they have a lot of war stories to tell on how difficult this is. Mohammed knows that I myself, when I was working under him, survived a car bomb because our project was responsible for trying to pass the famous or infamous, I don't know how you want to call it, telecommunications law. That's how serious the issue was. Gentlemen, I'm happy to report that the tide is turning now. That people are now beginning to realize maybe 80% of all, forget about the communication and the tracing and the interceptions, all the things that Peter talked about. 80% of all AIDs are exploded using SIM cards. It gets to that point that you actually need SIM cards to activate these car bombs. Therefore, people are beginning to realize that it's no longer sustainable to have a free-for-all in this field. If I come to the two questions that my friend specifically asked me, thank you very much for your kindness. I personally think that the Shabaab has finally gotten its match. The only way how we are going to resolve the clan issue and all these clan militias is another story. But getting rid of the Shabaab first, I think the Shabaab has got its match, because the Shabaab was using asymmetric warfare against the government and AMISOM, using their flexibility and their intermingling with the local community as a weapon. The Ma'awisle, these clans are now using exactly the same, they are flipping the script on them, and they are using the asymmetric warfare on them, as I have said earlier. Can one clan sustain this? Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that other clans and other areas have demonstrated that if they don't want the Shabaab and they commit to this cause enough, and they put the resources and they are resilient and they endure the pain, it is doable. It has been done in West Bakol by for example, the Jijele community, by the Olihan community in El Berde. Of course, it has been done in Puntland as a whole. Yes, it is doable. Of course, Somaliland, the Shabaab is not going to Puntland and Somaliland, not because of some other altruistic reason. It's because these communities and their governments have refused to accept them. So if you are committed enough, however small, no clan is small enough not to be able to resist the Shabaab if they have enough commitment. Will it be painful? Will there be setbacks? Yes. And that is why to spread the pain and to spread the cost, it is very desirable that all clans and all areas participate. On the specific point on these strongholds like El Bur, Mr. Gawai, Haradere, that area, we don't have the time to go into this, but let me tell you that because of the setbacks that the Shabaab has suffered in the last few weeks, they have made at least a tactical decision to withdraw from the eastern part of the Shabelle River. So for the first time, we will have an area coming all the way from Puntland to Mogadishu on the eastern side of the Shabelle River, which will be Shabaab free. How we deal with communities and areas on the west of the Shabelle River is another matter altogether. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think I still have a few hands raised up, Honorable Mohammed and Hassan of SBS. But before I let either of you, I just want to bring the issue to a local. And I want to invite Abdullahi, if you're still with us, Abdullahi Aden, to give us the Melbourne side of the story, where he's involved with the Somali community. So the next few minutes, Abdullahi, can you please give us your perspective on this issue? Welcome.
Thanks very much, Mohammed, for organizing this forum and this session. Basically, I was part of the government. I was part of the technical team almost 35 years ago in Somalia, and I left in 1984 and never went back. And at that time, we had this kind of stories. We didn't have any of these problems, but involving in the diaspora and organizing the diaspora here, whether we went to Turkey in Istanbul, or whether we are organizing a few forums down here in Melbourne. Anyone who is born in Australia, or who was born in Sweden, or who was born in London, they don't understand the complexity of all this. They have a very, they get to know a law and order country like Australia, where people respect the laws and that sort of things, even though they look like Somalis, but mentally they are not Somalis.
I'm deeply concerned, and I follow closely. I think in terms of global development, something that we can say with some confidence is that defeating Shabaab will be tough, because it will require at best incremental gains. The news that there are some incremental gains already in terms of territorial control. If step by step the territory under the intimidatory control, the taxation control, administration control of Shabaab is diminished, it will give people confidence and hope. And to be fair, this is a task that's bigger than just the Somali government. I applaud the new president and his resolve and his cabinet. But to really succeed, I think that the government needs to be backed up by international support. And to get the international support, yes, there is the distraction of the war in Ukraine, there's the drought, but there's also the sense that people have seen Shabaab persevering for the last 15 years and are asking themselves the question, is it really realistic to expect that despite the president's confidence, it's going to be defeated shortly? So incremental gains, incremental taking back of territory, holding territory, I think is very important for confidence building both inside Somalia and outside Somalia. Admittedly, it's very tough during a drought. So none of this is easy. In terms of international examples that speak to the situation in Somalia, there isn't anything exactly like Somalia. I mean, the situation is not as bad as Afghanistan. The Western alliance made many mistakes in Afghanistan, not least the manner in which they left. The government in Afghanistan was not prepared to stand by itself, particularly militarily, pulling out civilian contractors, supporting the Air Force, etc. It's a long story, but basically that was disastrous. And the Taliban is comparatively much stronger in Afghanistan. Shabaab is not that strong, but it is strong enough to be resilient and to hold this territory for a long period of time. You could look at the example of the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam in Sri Lanka, but you know, in some respects, the Sri Lankan government was always much stronger than the Somali government has been. And the Tamil Tigers, although they did initially have support within Tamil communities, lost that because of their methods. Now, there's some parallels there. I hasten to add, though, that the end of the civil war in Sri Lanka saw terrible human rights abuses and has left the country with crippling problems. And some of the current problems that Sri Lanka faces have to do with the way the war ended a decade ago. So I'm not recommending that as a way forward. Given the reality of the Horn of Africa, given what's happened at the moment in Ethiopia, the pressure of climate change and droughts, I think we have to be realistic about what can be achieved at what pace. And so setting some realistic incremental goals and then meeting them and appealing to the international community to say that this is possible, that there's a path forward, is really important to building confidence. Defeating a terrorist group in some respects is not so difficult. It's based on intelligence and undermining community support and breaking the cycle of recruitment. And as Peter said, there's important technological advancements that could have been made in terms of tracking communications. clearly it's not so easy in Somalia at the moment. But the problem with Shabaab is it's not just a terrorist group, it's also an insurgency, and that just compounds the problems. Now, I accept the argument that they've lost the legitimacy they may have once had with most people in Somalia. But even if they're a mafia force, the thing about mafia forces is you pay the protection money and you give in to them because you don't have a better alternative. And so unless it's possible to take back territory and keep people safe in terms of security, but also in terms of basic human needs, food, then there's always going to be this possibility of Shabaab reversing those gains. So I want to be optimistic, but I'm concerned about the next 12 months. And I do think we need to try and raise the profile of the situation in Somalia and the international community. But one of the best ways to do that will be get some incremental achievements, which then, a proof of concept that this is a turning point.
Well, thanks for that. Now, we are in the last, I think, 5 minutes. Perhaps if we can get 1 minute each, Peter Lang and Berhan, and finally Wara to wrap up in that order, perhaps.
One comment. I just have one comment, which is having had Peter Lang, Greg Barton, Honorable Ware, there is one thing that comes to mind when we discuss about issues of Somalia, which is when you go to the core of the problems that Somalia faces, it's a matter of rule and law. And you cannot solve that without having a constitution. Now, Somalia's constitution is not complete. And how could you progress from there without having a complete constitution?
Interesting observation. Okay, I guess Peter Lang and Ware, you each have 1 minute, I guess, if you want to wrap up, please.
Yes, thanks, Mohammed. Thanks, everybody. Just quickly in response to the comments that Mohammed made, I think that's exactly it. The problem is that introducing legislation is just taking a long time. The Communications Act was even longer, I think. Back then, it was many more years than that before it was finally passed. I just looked at the version I have, which I'm not sure whether it's the current version. It's the 2014 version. And sure enough, SIM card registration is covered in there. So there is a section in there specifying the need for SIM card registration. But as Mohammed also said, the problem is implementation. Even when it's in the law, is the capacity there, the local capacity to implement and execute these functions. Lawful intercept, by the way, in the version I have, there's no reference to it in the Communications Act. I'm not sure whether in the meantime, maybe it wasn't an issue that was in people's minds at the time when the law was drafted. Maybe it's been added in the meantime. But as I said, it's a standard provision in the telecommunications laws in most countries around the world. If it's not in there, that would certainly be an issue that should be put on the agenda to include it in the future.
Well, thank you for that. Now, finally, I want to allow Mohammed Ware to have the last word here. Ware, if you're still with us, yeah, I can see you. Now, you heard it all. You heard the Sydney and Melbourne and Berhan from Eritrea and Abdullah and everyone's views on this issue. But you're the man on the ground. You're the man behind I guess some of our folks in Melbourne are saying the Mawislay strategy. So please, having heard all these ideas, what's your take on this? But also, please give us your really personal view on this. We're calling this whole webinar post-Shabaab. I'm optimistic. I feel like we're nearly there. But on the other hand, we have to be realistic. In academia, we're very honest about these things. I'm providing the platform just to absorb your ideas. So we want to be very realistic. So please, over to you. And then Berhan, I'll also let you, if you speak with us, to say a few words after this, and then we'll wrap up. Ware, over to you.
Yes. So let me start by saying that I am not by any means underestimating the challenges and the complexities and the pain and the hardship that is required to get rid of the Shabaab. And some of the comments that Greg and Mohammed and others have portrayed are valid. So I am not underestimating the challenges ahead. However, let's take it at two levels, at the local level and at the national level. At the local level, in Iran and in other, then, following from that in other areas. The people of Iran, Eastern Iran particularly, are not in a fight of their choice. They are in an existential for survival. Therefore, they have no choice but to continue with this fight. Let me tell you that, especially when the Shabaab was on the ropes in the last few days of the fighting in Iran, an outreach has been made to elders, to politicians, and so on and so forth, with the Shabaab saying, behind the curtain, we give up on this area, leave us alone, we leave you alone. But as I said, the experience is there that this is not people who will keep their word. So the local people have no choice but to continue this resistance. Is it doable? Yes, because if Puntland can do it, if Somaliland can do it, if Alberta can do it, I don't see why people in Iraq cannot do it. It's as simple as that. I have, those of you who follow me on Twitter, I have been shouting from the rooftops, the Shabaab will only be in Somalia if you wish, if we, the Somalis, wanted to be there. It has been shown that it can be defeated. It has been shown that they are on the ropes. It has been shown that they have no legitimacy. The Shabaab will be in Somalia only, and I emphasize this, only if we want it to be. Now, how difficult is it to get our ducks in a row, as it were? Very complicated, very difficult. It's like trying to dewater a ship with holes on it. The more you remove, the more water will come in. Yes, but we still have to do it, because if we don't do it, then we sink. So that is, I cannot be stronger and firmer than that. It would help that other regions will contribute, not by coming to the assistance of the people of Iran. The people of Eastern Iran have done the job. There is not 1 inch of the territory of this community that is under the control of the Shabaab today. There are still some people running around, being chased around, and so on and so forth. Of course, the Shabaab is a very complicated enterprise, yes. But as far as territory, it has been proven that you can chase them and hold the territory. I very much support the viewpoint of Brigato. After all is said and done, what we need to do, and this is what we should have done many times, many opportunities before. We need a dialogue on a new social contract, as basic as that, because the arrangements that have been in Somalia from the 60s today have broken. Therefore, we cannot try to deal with this piecemeal. What we need to do is a South African style truth and reconciliation process, whereby we say collectively what went wrong. Why is it, as one of the panelists said, one people, one tribe, basically one ethnic group, what went wrong and how do we fix it? When I talk to people about the Constitution, many people take this legalese sort of superficial approach to the Constitution. No, the Constitution is nothing but the encoding of the agreements about the kind of society we want, a reaffirmation of the social contract. Therefore, it is very important that we have this dialogue. And then all these issues, we say, okay, as a community, as a society, do we want to let people blow us up? No. Are we willing to put up the resources? Yes. Are we willing to punish people who do this? Yes. Then we must start with SIM card registration, financial reforms, this and that and that. I think unless you have the dialogue in this way, whereby we confront ourselves and say, listen, we went astray, we went off the road. We need to come back to our senses and have this dialogue that everything else will be just this piecemeal firefighting, doing this, doing that, and I think this will not work in the long run.
Thank you, Ware. I think with that, I want to invite one more time Burhan to have the last word, 1 minute. Burhan, are you with us or?
Yes, Mohammed.
Yes, please, Burhan, you've got the last 1 minute,
Yes,
and then we'll wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, look, it's all been said, but I just want to focus. The underlying causes of our region is now famine. Famine is playing a critical role. Unless we all deal, we should not leave it to the international community. We have a role to play. Now, Ethiopia is the biggest in the region and has been the power of Africa. Now Ethiopia is going through a crisis. And I know this will be implications to Somalia. So we need to have a broader vision where we can all work together. This silo work has never helped us in the past, and I don't think will help us in the future. So we need leadership that has a vision in the region to bring forces together to work to alleviate this climate change. We need also, if possible, we need, like the Palestinians used to call the government in diaspora. We need a lobbying body. The world is guilty on that climate change, but we don't have a say in it. We're not there. So we need a government in diaspora that lobbies and addresses this to bring attention to the people working like Mohammed in the ground to make some changes, but starving people, to tell them, first you feed them, you get them out of their sickness, you give them education, and then you have a say. But starving people with no food, I don't think we are going to change anything unless we all work together and deal on this problem, particularly the famine, the climate change that's affecting, and that's a breeding ground for any crisis, be it in Ethiopia, be it in Somalia, be it in Sudan, be it in Eritrea, be it anywhere in that region. So we have got a common enemy, and that enemies that we think about: famine, drought, hunger, disease, and ignorance. If these are not dealt together, we will be staying there forever. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Burhan. I want to thank you all. It's been 1.5 hours of really informative and engaging discussion. I want to thank Greg Burton, Peter Lang, and Ware, who's joining us all the way from Mogadishu. Stay safe. Go and do the trick and treat for those of us who are in 31st October. May your horse win tomorrow if you're in Melbourne. And with that, I want to leave you with that positive note. We'll continue. There is the Somali Week coming up. Normally, I'm engaged with 4 universities: Melbourne University, Deakin, through Craig Burton, and Monash with Dr. Carson, also Swinburne, when I'm doing a research. So between these 4 universities, we will do the Somali Week soon. So this discussion will continue. In the meantime, stay safe, and thank you very much.